All right, let's go through. I think we know from a numbers perspective, like what the damage is here, and I think hopefully we'll talk a couple of these judges to get a sense of what the sort of the legal implications are of these folks on these courts. They all are uniquely horrible in their own ways, so it's hard to sort of pick one. But let's just start with Don Willett. First off, he is on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. Just explain for folks the circuit court system and the relative importance of the various circuit courts.
Right. So there are 12 circuit courts. They each oversee the law in a different region of the country, right? So if you've heard about the Ninth Circuit, which I'm sure you have because of the Muslim ban and all this kind of stuff, like that oversees California, Oregon, and Washington, right? The Second Circuit, where I live, oversees New York. The Fifth Circuit is the Texas, Louisiana, those are those people. A big reason why the law is different depending on what state you are in is not just because of your state courts. Your state courts are handling, your criminal justice issues, manslaughter and arson and that kind of stuff, and some kind of civil law. But the circuit courts oversee federal law as it is applied into these different regions. The circuit courts are why it is harder to have access to an abortion in Texas than it is in New York. It's not because of a Texas court versus a New York court. It's because of the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals versus the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. These courts of appeals are the rung right below the Supreme Court, and from a statistical standpoint, just to emphasize how important they are, the Supreme Court last year, the one that we all care about, or at least we know we're supposed to care about, they heard 70 cases last year out of 7,000 cases that were appealed for Supreme Court review and denied, and that doesn't even get into the thousands of cases that were never even appealed to the Supreme Court. So for a lot of the law that you experience in your kind of day-to-day life, that law, the final arbiter on that law is often the circuit courts of appeals.
And these circuit courts take on distinct characteristics in part because, and this is less relevant in the age of McConnell, but it used to be the home senators from these states, right, which make up any given circuit, would recommend the judges and could prevent and block judges by withholding what was known as a blue slip. McConnell has done away with that. Patrick Leahy is sitting there probably pining to reinstitute it in the event that he takes over the Senate, because that's just the way that Democrats roll. They completely forsake any sense of power. But be that as it may, is that why the characteristics? And then also there is the nature of the cases that come up in those circuits is a function of sort of the people from there? I mean, why is it so reliable that the Fifth Circuit will give us, the cases that would harm a woman's right to choose, for instance, as opposed to the Second Circuit?
Right. So you're right on both points, Sam. And you're absolutely right that Patrick Leahy and Dianne Feinstein and Chuck Schumer are somewhere being like, oh, I missed the blue slips. Where did they go? Like the way that it used to work was that if the senators from the region of the circuit that you were nominated from had what was called a blue slip, which was like a quiet way of telling the president, yeah, I don't like that guy. So if you want to say like, hey, Elie Mystal should be a judge on the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, Kristen Gillibrand could just slip a little blue slip and be like, no, we're not going with that crazy guy. And then I wouldn't be nominated, right? Like, that's how it was supposed to work. McConnell said, to heck with all that. He's nominating the Federal Society judges that he wants, and he has the power, and you can't stop him, right? So they've completely done away with the blue slips, which is one of the reasons why some of these particularly radical conservatives are on the court now, and they weren't on before, as I kind of explained in my piece. But the other reason why you get these very kind of distinct legal traditions in each circuit is that each circuit itself is, supposed to be respectful of its own circuit precedent as well as Supreme Court precedent and whatever. So, like, the law kind of builds up over time in these places. And then the third thing is, as you say, the reason why a woman's right to choose is being kind of attacked in the Fifth Circuit and not in the Ninth Circuit is because Louisiana is trying to pass laws ending abortion, whereas California is not. Right.
Right.
So if you have a law on the book saying nobody can have an abortion in Louisiana, that's going to end up in front of the Fifth Circuit. California isn't passing that kind of stuff, and so they don't have to rule on that kind of law. They don't have to make precedent on that kind of law, and the system just kind of reinforces itself.
So Don Willett on the Fifth Circuit
guy.
of Appeal. Yes, tell us about Don Willett.
So look, first of all, Sam, the hardest part about writing this piece was picking just 7.
Right.
Because
well, like I say, if you write a follow-up, we'll have you back.
Right. I highlighted Don Willett because he is famous in legal circles because he used to have a Twitter account. And it's very, very rare for a judge to have any social media exposure, much less as well regarded as Willett's was. And his Twitter account is, fine. It's like dad jokes and here's some cornbread shaped like Texas and all this kind of, hot aw shucks humor laced in there with some seriously anti-LGBT, anti-trans rhetoric, right? And that's his thing. I like to say that people generally in real life are nicer than they are on Twitter, but Willett is the opposite. He goes to Twitter to look nice, but then when he gets to work, that's where all of these kind of mean streaks come out of him. His issue, he's very anti-marriage rights, to the point that when he was now on the state court, not on the circuit court in Texas, even after the same-sex marriage case went through, he did everything he could to delay the implementation of same-sex marriage in Texas. He's basically the Kristen Davis woman from Kentucky, only in a robe, as opposed to a mere clerk, right, on LGBT rights. He's against women's rights. He's a strong supporter of the Second Amendment. That's another thing that I try to tell, especially young people, about why they should care about the courts. Young people think that, the reason why we don't have reasonable gun regulations is because the NRA is so powerful and elected officials are afraid of the NRA. That's partially the reason, but the other reason is that if you try to pass significant gun legislation, courts will knock those laws down because they have people like Don Willett on them who believe that the Second Amendment is pretty much the only individual right that matters.
So, all right, and we should say James Dobson of Focus on the Family, he doesn't seem to be in the news as much these days, once called him the most conservative judge in the country, which is, I don't know, it's like...
and Don Willett's proud of that.
Yeah.
He put that in his campaign ads. Hey, I'm the most conservative judge in Texas. Who says that?
Well... I mean, I guess it's Texas, and it seemed to have worked. Tell us also about Willett well, all right, well, so what can, and maybe this is good to set this because, certainly a lot of these judges would be interested, what can a judge like this do to implicate marriage equality, right? It's the law of the land. We have already, Obergefell versus Hodges. It exists, and the Supreme Court has ruled on this. What can be done by circuit judges to begin to unravel this? This is, of course, premised on the idea that someone brings these cases in there that are already calculated to give the judge an opening to do these things. But what can they do? What can they do? Isn't it resolved now?
No, and here's the thing, right? If you think about marriage equality this way, all the Supreme Court has said is that if you go to your justice of the peace and ask for a marriage license to marry a person of your same sex, you cannot be denied. That's all it is, and that's great. That's amazing. That's serious progress. But that's also pretty limited, right? There are all these other kind of attenuated benefits of marriage that conservatives can still try to stop. For instance, same-sex benefits is something that Don Willett has been very against throughout his entire career, refusing to give death benefits to people who are married in a same-sex couple. We think that we're going to get we think that's probably also now set settled. But there are other issues, right? Let's say, okay, if my wife and I are married, and if we wanted to adopt a child, we could. But if my wife was named Chris as opposed to Christine, and I wanted to go adopt a child, well, then guess what? Don Willett has actually written opinions about this, would say that gay people are not allowed to adopt children, right? Even if they're in a married, committed relationship, right? So there are all of these, and that doesn't even get into the fact that, like, okay, the Supreme Court says that I can be married, I can have a same-sex marriage. Can I get a cake at my wedding? Can I get a floral arrangement up in here? Probably not, according to these conservative judges. So while, yes, the basic right to get a marriage license is now relatively secured, we think, there are a lot of benefits to being married that these conservatives can still try to deny the LGBTQ community.
Okay, let's talk about Collins v. Mnuchin, because Willett was involved in this. What's the relevance of that case?
Okay, so as I'm sure many people have heard, Donald Trump gets pissed off at his director of the Federal Reserve Board from time to time, right? He wants interest rates to be low because he thinks that helps the economy. The Fed is supposed to be a nonpartisan, non-political entity, and it's supposed to monitor our money and make sure that inflation doesn't get too high and all these other things. And and Donald Trump wants to put political pressure on the head of the Fed to do what Donald Trump wants. Technically, Donald Trump should not be able to fire the head of the Fed. That's the whole point of having an independent agency. But in Collins versus Mnuchin, Willett was part of a decision that explained a very minor agency, a fair housing administrative head. Basically, Trump had fired him, and there was a lawsuit, and the Willett court said that it was okay for Trump to fire this very minor agency head. But the way they explained the agency made that agency sound suspiciously like the Federal Reserve Board. So what they're doing, and you were just talking about why are different circuits different? Like what Willett was doing there is setting precedent so that if Trump fires the head of the Federal Reserve, the Fifth Circuit can then just point to this decision that they themselves wrote and say, like, oh, we're not being crazy. We're just following our own guidelines about who Trump can fire and who he can't fire. And this is totally in keeping with precedent that we just made up last week. That's the problem with a case like Collins v. Mnuchin. It's again, the conservatives are not dumb, right? They know what they're doing, and they're basically like setting up a paper trail so that they can justify overturning well-established law in the future.
This is a dynamic that I think people really have to understand because there's a strong argument that we're seeing this on the Supreme Court in a whole host of areas, not the least of which the questions of what rights or what ability, I guess, agencies have to actually take a broad mandate from Congress and put it into effect so that the EPA can decide that, hey, this new material that's developed that's being burned and put into the air is actually a pollutant. We're going to go after that. We don't need Congress to do the research on this and then tell us specifically go after this one particular pollutant. Go ahead.
Again, when I talk to young people about climate change, if you care about climate change, your problem is not which Democratic candidate supports the Green New Deal and which one doesn't. Your problem is that conservatives have been stacking the courts with these deregulatory judges, and when they say deregulatory, you think that they're just talking about laissez-faire capitalism. No, they're talking about removing the ability to force corporations to do things that we need them to do for environmental purposes, right? That's the whole point of this deregulation gambit by the conservatives. And so if you don't control the courts, then guess what? You can't get a Green New Deal because you can't get the regulation necessary to control carbon emissions or mercury leaking or methane tanks. Like, you can't get those regulations in place if you have all of these judges who say that regulation is basically unconstitutional.
Right. To me, this is like the area where it's really the most dangerous. Because at one point, social mores will catch up and they'll overwhelm the judiciary. But I just don't think there's enough sophistication, frankly, amongst the general public that understands that these are courts that are going after the structure of our government. They are inhibiting, never mind specific regulations, like you say, they're inhibiting the mechanism in which to create these regulations, and that's what's so disturbing. Let's go to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, Chad Riedler, and I got to say, maybe this is an important time to say this too. Everyone you've picked out here, but for one, is someone, well, maybe one is 53, but the rest are in their late 40s. I mean, this is all folks sort of like vaguely who came up of age in their teens and in their college years during the Reagan era. And it seems to me that's not a mistake. I mean, like, you're getting the youngest people possible and put them into lifetime positions. And they're going to be, I mean, these are people who, I don't know. I mean, I'm trying to think of some young conservative who's going to have the opportunity to appoint to the Supreme Court when they're president, 20 years out from now.
Yep. And again, like I say, these people have been bred. They weren't born this way. They were bred this way. They were incubated this way. They were taught to be this way. And now they are being unleashed on the rest of us. So, when you talk about Chad Riedler, 47, I believe, I highlighted him to do two things. One, everybody wants to fight about immigration right now. Everybody wants to fight. Everybody's, these children in cages. Oh no, what are we going to do? Chad Riedler is the guy that wants to put them in the cages. And now, instead of being a mere political advocate, he is a judge, which he will have the power to say, no, we actually don't have to treat children humanely if they come here from another country. We actually don't have to give them toothpaste. We actually don't have to give them showers. Not by constitutionally speaking, they have no rights. That's what Chad Riedler is able to do now in his position on the circuit court. The other reason why I brought him up is that he is a punishment for Democrats who did not take back the Senate in 2018. Yes, midterm, blue wave, we won the House. Ooh, great, I love it. Awesome. We didn't take back the Senate. In fact, we lost seats in the Senate. Chad Riedler was nominated by Trump before the midterms, when the Republicans only had a one-vote majority in the Senate. He was denied appointment because he also happens to be against the ACA and has written all these kinds of briefs of trying to roll back pre-existing conditions and all this kind of stuff. So he didn't have Susan Collins' vote. Susan Collins will vote for an alleged attempted rapist, but she won't vote for somebody who openly is against Obamacare, right? So she didn't have Susan Collins' vote, so he couldn't get through before the midterms. But after the midterms, when Republicans picked up seats in the Senate despite the blue wave, Trump just renominated him. Trump and McConnell were just like, let's roll it back. And this time he passed 52 votes because they still lost Collins, right? Chad Riedler is what happens when Democrats do not focus on the Senate and instead have their eyes starrily fixated on the presidential nomination, right? I put him in there specifically to say that all of these kind of interchangeable centrist white Democrats who think that the only thing they can do with their lives is run for president, man, go back home to your state, to your purple states, and help us take back the Senate, because if you don't take back the Senate, you cannot either get your own judges, as Barack Obama proved, or you cannot stop Trump judges, as Mitch McConnell has proved.
I mean, there's two more things to note here. Well, one is just building on that point. A crappy senator in Texas, say, or in Alabama, for that matter, means a great deal in this context because, like you say, one vote. One member of the Republicans abandons this guy, and he doesn't get in. I don't care if Doug Jones, is up there voting on crappy stuff half the time. If he's keeping out judges like this, that's a good thing for the far left, who might want programs that that are more humane and whatnot. He was Attorney General Jeff Sessions' right-hand man in the Civil Division of Department of Justice. So whenever they were asking, is it okay to separate children from their families, he was the one saying, yep.
Yep, and he didn't have to do that. There are other people this is not a case of just following orders, right? There were other people in the Department of Justice who refused to make these arguments. There are other people who have resigned. There are other people who have quit. Chad Riedler volunteered for the assignment, right? So you make the point about the Doug Jones and Joe Manchins. I mean, I've sat here online the past week and a half, and I've had to hear liberals throw Amy McGrath under the bus, who's running against Mitch McConnell. Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? If Amy McGrath can beat Mitch McConnell, that would be the most important senatorial victory that we have had since since Stephen Douglas lost his seat to Abraham Lincoln. All right, actually, Douglas won that election, so I don't even know where I would go, right? John C. Calhoun or something. Taking out a Mitch McConnell is so important. And if it takes a conservative Democrat to do it in Kentucky, fine. Fine, we can live with that. Right. I want to hear if liberals want to get on liberals who are not progressive enough. Go to California and deal with Dianne Feinstein, who's the minority leader on the Senate Judiciary Committee, who does nothing when these conservative justices show up. If liberals want to get on other liberals for not being progressive enough, go to New York, where Chuck Schumer is the minority leader for the Democratic Party and does nothing when these judges come up.
I want to endorse everything you just said. If Amy McGrath voted with the Democrats 5% of the time, it would be still the greatest victory we could hope for in getting rid of Mitch McConnell. I mean, in terms of actually material benefits to folks on society, everybody.